Hello, Andy.
Hi Chris, how you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Not too bad, thanks. I've read your latest book, The Knockout. Obviously, I know you, or people would heard of you from Sky Sports doing a commentary there. Um, Fully enjoyed the book, and we are gonna get into it. But before we do, and I say so, my guest, basically, what is your journey up until this point? So how did you, in short, become a commentator?
So I left university back in 1999 and I left without any particularly clear idea about what it was that I was going to do, which then was quite normal. But when you look at the circumstances that people go to university under now and the debt that they emerge from university with, I look back at it now and realize what a privilege that was, to be honest, to be able to just do the 3 years and really enjoy it and come out of the other end not having really thought too hard about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I don't think you get that luxury now, to be honest. But that's how it was then. And I finished and I had a good think about what it was that I wanted to do. I really enjoyed the course that I did. So I knew that I needed to do something that was going to really hold my interest and keep me invested. And I'd always loved sport. I'd always just loved sport. And I looked at sports broadcasting and thought, well, people do this for a living. It's not this impossible thing. And back then, there were lots of independent, commercial, local stations that carried quite a heavy sports program. They would do commentary home and away on local teams, as well as the BBC stations. And that was the route in, really, via radio. And after sending letters back then, the idea of sending someone a letter, that was kind of hilarious, isn't it? But yeah, and a few cold calls and stuff like that, I managed to get my foot in the door at Talksport, as it turned out, which was a national station, but was kind of run more like a local operation because it was in London and there weren't that many people that worked there, to be honest. And once you got a foot in the door anywhere, then it was just up to you to kind of take it from there. And that's what happened. And you kind of figured out what it was that you wanted to do, what it was that you were most keen on. And I always thought it would be to be a commentator because I always wanted to be at the sporting event. But I know plenty of people who started thinking that's what they wanted to do, and in the end they went into production. And I moved from radio to TV, and that's kind of how it's gone, really, for the last 24 years. Yeah, because I started in April 2000.
You've been commentating that long? 20.
No, I wasn't an out and out commentator to start with. I went to my first game. So basically, Talksport was a great place to start because you got to do things quickly there. I think much more quickly than you would have done anywhere else because it was run by, at that point, Kelvin McKenzie, who was this phenomenally successful editor of The Sun in the 1980s. And he'd moved out of newspapers into other things. And some of the other guys there were the people who had been with him at the time, who he'd kind of taken with him to his new ventures. And they were they were kind of really straightforward to work for. They wanted people who had some ambition, had some drive, were prepared to gamble a bit. So if you got asked, do you want to do this? Do you want to go to this press conference next week? You've never been to one before, but do you want to do it? You put your hand up and said yes, knowing that you had kind of 4 or 5 days in the meantime to figure out where you needed to go, how you used the equipment, but how everything worked. You would just kind of back yourself to discover what it was that you needed to discover. And it was that kind of a place, basically. So it wasn't that long after I started that I started going to matches as a reporter. So that probably happened about 6 months after I started, which again seems kind of mad now, but I was really, really nervous. Everybody is when they do something for the first time. Anyone who says that they aren't, they're just full of shit, I'm afraid. I mean, it's just not truthful and not helpful when people claim that they've never suffered from nerves and all that kind of thing. Because if it's something you really want to do and you care about, then you should be nervous. You don't want it to be too debilitating, although it did feel like it
Yeah.
that first time, I have to say. But I did that for a long time, basically. On different sports, but mainly football, because football is just so big. I did as much boxing as I could. And then I started commentating on football probably about 2009, something like that. And then I did I did one season of that Sky. And then via a mate of mine who was in the boxing department tried to, well, successfully kind of segued into boxing. And that's where I've been ever since. Although I did football and boxing probably for about a few years actually, because yeah, boxing's quite niche. There's a lot of work now, but then there wasn't quite so much. So yeah, you have to kind of build into it and learn the ropes and just build up your portfolio of skills, really, I guess, and experience. And that's how it was then. You couldn't really rush it because other people decided whether you were ready to do things or not. And so you had to be patient. Patience was something you had to have, because, as I say, it would be the program controller, the editor, who would decide whether you were ready to be kind of let loose on whatever it was that you really wanted to do. And it could be frustrating at times. It's different now because with a digital platform, you can kind of put yourself to air. And the perfect combination, I think, is to be in the environment I was in, where you've got people showing you stuff, teaching you stuff, keeping you sort of grounded if you needed that, making sure you didn't get carried away, but then also being able to just practice by yourself on the YouTube platform. I think that would be the perfect marriage. But it's more difficult now because those outlets I mentioned earlier, the radio stations in particular, where you could get a foot in the door, a lot of them don't really exist anymore in the way that they did then. Capital Gold's a good example. Up your way, you look at WM, and other local stations where BRMB, where they might still be big on their sport. I don't really know, but I know a lot of stations like that, big commercial stations, independent local commercial stations, they kind of downscaled on that side of things, and it's been kind of a shame to see, to be honest.
Do you remember the first fight card you commentated on? What was the headline fight?
So the first one I did it was at York Hall. It would have been late 2011. It was a midweek show on Sky, and it was Colin Lyons against Lee Purdy for the British welterweight title. I was doing a few undercard fights, and then probably the top 2 hours of the show got broadcast, and so all the undercard fights that go out live now, either on the main platform or on YouTube, they would only see the light of day if the main fights went short, then you needed to add them in. So I was doing the undercard there. Ian Darke was doing the top of the bill. It was a really good fight, actually. Lee Purdy was the champion. Colin Lyons beat him. Two guys from East London, Essex. Really good crowd, full house. And yeah, that was the first one. I'd done some work in boxing before that, but mainly, reporting, press conferences. But that was the first time I commentated. Yeah, and that would have been, yeah, late November time, 2011, I think.
Oh. So obviously you commentated on a lot of fight cards, and obviously you've seen a lot of knockouts, which is a subject of your book. Why did you decide to write a book, and also why on this particular subject?
Well, a book was something I'd always wanted to do, but I certainly never kind of fooled myself into thinking that it would be something that would just happen, because it's hard getting a book over the line. You've written one yourself, so you know that it's difficult. It's difficult because publishers, sponsors, everyone really is kind of suspicious of boxing, even though it's lent itself to the screen and to the page in a way that I don't think any other sport ever has. It's provided some of the greatest sporting literature we've got, some of the greatest sporting based films we've got, although, as we all know, boxing films, as people call them, aren't really boxing films. They're life films with boxing in them, which is, I think that's why everybody loves Rocky so much. But it was something I definitely always wanted to do. And the idea for the knockout just came because there are so many things that feed into it. It's it is about that feeling of what is it like to do it? What is it like if it happens to you? Because I didn't really feel like I'd ever read much where people got asked that, apart from the odd chapter here or there. And I felt like, having been around fighters for a long time, they would be more forthcoming than people might think, particularly on the negative side of the coin, because that one you might think people might not want to go into. But I just thought that if you pick people you knew, you might get a bit more out of them than maybe people had hitherto suspected. And with the knockout, it's also the psychology of it that really fascinated me. How do you reconcile yourself with that situation? Because all boxing is, by its nature, a one-on-one of the most extreme variety. So how just getting in the ring in the first place to take part in that is something. But if you're the kind of fighter who looks to win inside the distance, and you're going in with somebody who's like you can be pretty sure that one of you is going down.
Mhm.
So how do you go about approaching that situation? Do you stick your head in the sand and think, well, it can't happen to me? I never admit any weakness. Defeat is impossible, not just unthinkable, it's also impossible. I'm never going to get knocked out. Or do you have to let it in and think to yourself, okay, well, this is the game I'm in. It could happen. I need to be ready for it in case it does. How would I get over it if it does happen? How can I use the kind of fear or awareness of it as a possibility to kind of drive me, to give me that edge? So there were just loads of things about it which just fed into it as a subject. And also I knew that, or I kind of hoped anyway, that just the sheer spectacle of it would help tempt a publisher to go for it, because it is this incredible moment, this absolutely incredible moment that other sports just don't have, and it has an impact in a way that no other moment in any other sport has. Whether you like boxing or not, there's just no denying that the drama of it is inescapable. So it's kind of all of those different reasons, really.
If you say, if you have a football game and it's a draw and then someone makes an amazing run and then scores a long range goal, the crowd go wild. Or if it's cricket and someone hits a six, the crowd go wild. But yet when I watch boxing and a knockout occurs, yes, the crowd go wild, but there seems to be, I don't want to use the word animalistic, but that's the closest I can think of in terms of how the crowd reacts. Why is that compared to what I've just described? Because it seems to me like there's almost ambivalence when a knockout happens, in that there's a euphoric joy from the crowd, and then if, say, the boxer's still on the floor, then it's like, oh, okay, maybe we're enjoying this a bit too much, but then I'll come back and watch another boxing fight.
No, that's exactly it. That you described it kind of perfectly, and that is why it's so fascinating, because it's this really conflicting thing. We all want to see knockouts. Boxing wouldn't be boxing without knockouts. It wouldn't be popular without knockouts, without the spectre of the knockout, the lure of the knockout. It's what people want to see. But at the same time, when you do see one, as someone is stretched out and then not moving, all of a sudden the mood changes really, really quickly. And it's kind of led by the winning fighter. They're celebrating, and then all of a sudden they're not. Their stomach drops, because in that moment, you don't know whether that person who's down is alive or dead. You don't know whether they'll recover. And people might think that sounds a bit dramatic, but that is just a fact.
Mhm.
I've seen fighters lying down, absolutely stock still, not moving a muscle. And at that point, you would not be able to tell, looking at them, whether they were alive or not. And then you just hope you see them move. And then you hope you see some signs of recovery. But when you see the knockout, it is this adrenaline surge that just swamps everyone at ringside, and in the immediate surroundings, even in a stadium, even right up the back. You can feel it. It's just this incredible, electrifying moment, and it just ignites that kind of bloodthirstiness, which I think is in us all. as humans, because people always compare boxing to the, you know, modern day gladiators, the Colosseum. And it's different because people don't get, in the Colosseum, people would get killed. People would expect to see people get killed, but not in all circumstances. Gladiators were very valued. They were very prized. And if you were in that business, you wanted to keep your top guys operational for as long as you possibly could. And if you did well enough, you get given your freedom, you would get retired, and you would live out your life. So it's not the case that everybody in the Colosseum ended up with their blood and their insides on the sand. That wasn't really how it was. So boxing and the Colosseum, they do bear comparison, and that desire to watch people go at it is just part of the human condition. Now, some people will deny that and say, well, not me. And that may well be true. That may well be true. It's not a one size fits all, but generally speaking, it is in there. It is in there. And whether you like it or not, and that's an interesting thing to consider, isn't it? Whether you should like it, whether you like the fact that you like it or not, it's just there. And it has been for centuries, for millennia, because fighting is as old as people itself. You know, sport is a relatively modern concept, really. Team sport, as we know it, and that's what people think of as sport now, isn't it? When you mention sport, they think of football immediately, basically, and other sports too. But team sports didn't really start until the kind of mid 19th century. Before that, sport was kind of one-on-one duels, whether it was pistols, whether it was swords, whether it was these wild, crazy bets they'd make against each other. But it was always one person against one person, some kind of race, you know, some kind of challenge. And so boxing's always been there. But fighting is even older than that. And it is something that everybody understands, whether they've had one or not. You can see two people in a car park fighting. You can see two people in a boxing ring fighting, and you know what's going on. Immediately, you know what's going on. And if one hits the other and the other hits the ground and doesn't get up, you know what has happened. Somebody has won. And that's just, it's the simplest sporting equation there is.
Is it a sudden nature of it as well? In that you could be losing a fight. Say if it's like a team sport and you're behind, and then you slowly crawl your way back up, the crowd will sense it, that slowly crawling your way back up. But with boxing, you could be losing the fight, and then suddenly, just like that, one punch could change it all. So to give you an example, I'd watched earlier today in preparation for this, the first fight between Dillian White and Alexander Povetkin, which White was winning, and then suddenly in the fifth round, bang, the uppercut, White's laid out. Is that one of the things that makes boxing different from most sports? It's the suddenness of it more than anything else.
Yeah, it is. It is. And you know what? That's a brilliant choice of knockout. It didn't make it into the book, that one, because I didn't really manage to get hold of Dillian in the end. And I never wanted to push things too much with anybody. So, but the reason why that one's so good is because, as you say, he was winning the fight. He was ahead, and you thought it's a matter of time before he takes Povetkin out. And then you had the added aspect that it was during COVID, so there was not really anybody there. You had the kind of like wind whispering through the trees in mass schools, and you know, it did kind of take me back to. I remember sitting there watching it actually and thinking to myself, wow, this is kind of like, this is maybe what it was a bit like back in the bare knuckle days, where they would all just kind of disappear off to somewhere in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere, to evade the local constabulary because it wasn't legal. And it would be in this kind of setting out the back of a big house, because you know the upper classes were into their bare knuckle. They loved it, and they would kind of sponsor it. And I was looking around, just thinking, but this is probably as close as I'll ever get to that kind of scenario. Then all of a sudden, Povetkin throws that uppercut and lays him out flat on his back, and you could hear a pin drop. And that happens in arenas as well sometimes. But all of a sudden, everything had changed, and it's completely irreversible. And that is what makes it so unique, because if you're going to score a last minute goal, a last second goal, you've got to be within striking distance for it to count. And for it to be super dramatic, it's got to be right at the end of the match. I was watching the new 99 doc on Amazon the other day about Manchester United's treble season, 25 years ago now. And that conclusion to that Champions League final between them and Bayern Munich, that's the most dramatic sporting knockout outside of boxing I can probably think of, because they were losing heading into extra time, and then they scored twice in extra time and they won. And you look at the reaction of the Bayern players, and they did kind of look like they'd been punched in the face. You know, they just couldn't quite believe it. But it's very difficult to get any kind of equivalent to it because, as I say, you've got to be within striking distance to make that kind of thing count in all other sports, but not in boxing. And they did try, and this is one thing I mentioned in the book, they did try the kind of equivalent of a knockout with the golden goal, but it didn't work, did it? Because people didn't like it. And what they didn't like about it was how sudden and final it was. It didn't seem it didn't seem fair almost that somebody scores and then it's over. I mean, you've already had 90 minutes, so again, you've got to be within striking distance and all of that. But it wasn't popular because fans didn't like the fact that there was no chance for the other team to come back. They couldn't handle that moment. It was too much. And they binned it, I think, after about 3 or 4 tournaments because, yeah, this situation where you've got something that seems so full of potential and hope 1 second and then bang, it's just done the next second. It's a really weird thing to get your head around.
It's interesting in the book how you talk to different fighters, because a lot of it obviously centers around the rivalry between Carl Froch and George Groves, but he also talked to Tony Bellew when he won his world title at Goodison Park. And it leads me to this, which is, does the location of where knockout occurs affect a person's euphoria or downfall? So in Tony Bellew's case, because of how the knockout occurred, and also factors at Goodison Park, which is obviously the home ground of the team he supports, did that have an effect on him in regards to how he felt about that particular knockout?
Yeah, definitely. There are factors that feed into it, and that is one. You know, how big is the fight? Where is the fight? The magnitude of the fight? What's at stake, basically, does play a big part. And for Bellew, it was absolutely massive for him because boxing at Goodison was what he'd always wanted to do, but it's a double-edged sword. And as he said to me, if he'd lost, he would never have gone back to Goodison again. And so when he won, because it was at Goodison and because it was for a world title and the WBC belt, the one that he'd always wanted, there was almost too much on it. It was almost too big. And so when he won, he really didn't know what to do. And it was just relief more than anything else. And a lot of people said that to me, was that when you win by knockout, it's not really this moment of pure jubilation. It's more relief, or rather, it's the kind of the relief that fuels the euphoria. And for Bellew, that was absolutely the case, because he knew that if he lost, he just wouldn't probably ever get over it. And that sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it, when you say it out loud? But I don't think he would have done. Josh Warrington said the same thing actually after he boxed Lee Selby at Elland Road, and he didn't knock him out, but he won, obviously. And his dream was to box at his football club's home ground, but almost there was too much on it, because again, he said the same thing. If he lost, he never would have been able to go back there.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I remember, I think it was Chris Eubanks Sr. who talked about, in a way, you almost have to go into fights with a sense of delusion, in a sense, because if you think about it too much, then you get too frightened and whatnot, and so on and so forth. So, in regards to the psychology of knockouts, do you almost have to go into the ring with a sense of delusion? Yeah, a sense of delusion, in that you can't be too worried about what's coming back at you, despite the fact that a natural occurrence would be, if you was in the street, then you would be worried about what's coming back to you and probably run the other way, or even fight.
Yeah, it's this really kind of complex mental state that you have to manage to take yourself into. And this was what I found most interesting about it, actually, was that if you're going to be successful, everybody I spoke to said the same. They said two things to me that they all agreed on. One was that if you get caught by a good punch you're not braced for and don't really see, then you can get knocked out. And that can happen to anyone. And everyone agreed, even fighters who've never been knocked out. Froch Jamie Moore, my two guys out of everyone who'd never been knocked out, said, yeah, of course it could have happened. It just didn't. And the other thing they all agree on is that you need to be realistic. You need to accept that it could happen to you. That doesn't make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. That doesn't mean you obsess about it to the point where you worry about it and you walk to the ring drained of all nervous energy, fearful that it's going to happen. And then, of course, it becomes more likely that it will. You can't have that, but you have to tread this line between self-belief and self-delusion almost, where you take that realism and you use it to fuel you during training. Basically, that fear that it could happen, the fact that you accept that it could happen, you use that to fuel you during camp and make you concentrate completely and focusing completely on doing what you need to do, because if you don't, that is what could happen. So you can use it in that way, but then at some point, either during fight week or maybe before that, it's a very individual thing, or on the day of the fight, or even walking to the ring, you have to decide that this thing that you've just been admitting to yourself could happen is not going to happen. You have to flick that switch. And I found the idea of that really interesting. A psychologist called it compartmentalization, which is basically the ability to separate out conflicting thoughts that if you allow them to mingle, then you're going to have a big problem. And, you know, a lot of this stuff is pretty relatable because it's a very extreme thing going into a boxing ring, but I think everybody can understand the necessity to do that, because whatever it is that you're aiming for, if it's something that's really worth having, then there's always a chance that it won't work out. And that'll be with you. You'll think about it, but you need to try and use it in the right way, try and channel it in the right way. And then when it comes to the night, whether, you know, it's boxing as it is for these guys, or whether for, you know, whether you do stand-up comedy or whether you're doing public speaking or anything that you're nervous about, first date, you know, it can be anything. You have to decide that actually this is not going to be a disaster. This is going to go well. But with fighters, because they do live their lives at this ridiculous extreme, delusion is a word that you hear them talk about quite a lot. Moses Itauma said that to me in Saudi recently. He said, you know, to be as fighters, you need to be delusional at times, and that some of the biggest upsets in boxing history came from the most delusional people, was what he said. And yeah, I found that really interesting.
One of the fights you mentioned, which was a very short fight, but you mentioned in the book, is when Amir Khan lost for the first time against Brady's Prescott, the fight that was stopped in less than a minute. I can't remember who was he fought afterwards, but I remember apart from his defense, his hands were a lot higher and whatnot. He generally seemed okay in terms of how he approached the fight. I look at someone like Lennox Lewis, who, when he lost first time against Oliver McCall, and then he fought a gentleman called Lionel Buckler afterwards, and you can tell he was still nervous. It was almost a bit gun shy, so to speak. What factors affect boxers in regards to how they recover from a knockout psychologically?
There are quite a few different ones, and I think for anybody, sorry, you are going to carry it into your next fight. There is going to be a level of apprehension. The person I spoke to in the most detail, who I thought did manage to shrug it off pretty easily, was Matt Macklin after getting knocked out by Jamie Moore. His attitude was, well, this is boxing. This is boxing. I went off too quick. I was absolutely exhausted. He landed a good shot and I got knocked out. He was knackered as well. If I managed to land one on him, I probably would have knocked him out. It is what it is, and we all move on. But he still was happy to admit that when he went into his next fight, you know, there was that extra little bit of apprehension, maybe, or fear, whatever quite the right word is, because you know then that it has happened. And having the acceptance that it could happen when it hasn't actually happened, that's one thing, because it hasn't happened to you yet. But knowing that it can happen because it has happened, that's an altogether different thing, I think. And some fighters struggle. They do struggle to get over it. And the amount that you struggle, I think, depends on a number of different things. And a lot of it can be down to kind of when it happens in your career, because if it happens early, before you've really had too much of a chance to get much in the bank in terms of confidence and achievements, then it can be difficult to get over because, as I say, you don't have much to hold on to. You just have to try and shrug it off and continue. If it happens when you have got a few things under your belt, then I think it's a bit more straightforward. But it will kind of depend on what kind of knockout it is. If you get caught with one early in the fight, you don't see it, you're not braced for it, as everybody agrees, you can get knocked out. That, I think, is quite an easy one to sell to yourself. Getting taken out late in a grueling dogfight, again, I think you can explain that to yourself reasonably. You can think to yourself, well, I gave a good account of myself, like Matt did, and pick out a few different reasons why that might have happened. The really difficult ones, I think, are the ones where fighters have achieved a lot. They might be unbeaten still. They might not be unbeaten. They might have lost a fight, close decision, debatable decision, split decision, whatever, where it's an L on the record, but they definitely don't see it as any kind of a defeat. They've achieved a lot, and often they will still be unbeaten. And they've got to that point where it isn't like they don't think they can lose. They haven't completely lost that realism of what can happen in the ring, but they have got to a stage where they're probably starting to think to themselves, okay, well, that kind of knockout where you get broken down bit by bit, dismantled and then chinned, that can't happen to me. And then if it does happen, you've got a huge problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so hard for Ricky Hatton to get over the knockout to Mayweather and then also the knockout to Pacquiao, because what happened to him against Mayweather, I think he got to the point where he never really thought that could happen, to be honest, that he would get kind of picked apart and knocked out. And then against Pacquiao, just get absolutely flattened, just steamrolled and flattened in the way that he did. I think he found it very, very difficult to come to terms with. And we saw another one recently with Anthony Joshua and Francis Ngannou. Now, I know that Ngannou was a boxing novice, but he did what he did against Fury, whatever people thought about it. So he was he was there on merit. I don't think there's any universe in which Francis Ngannou thought that could happen to him, that somebody could just basically clobber him like Joshua did, just absolutely take him out. And I think that'll be hard. I think that'll be really, really hard to get past because, as I say, if it happens at that point where you've achieved a lot and you've allowed yourself to probably think that there's a certain mode of defeat that could never be visited on you, and then it happens, I think those are probably the worst ones.
There are certain fighters in history, like a Mike Tyson or Deontay Wilder, where they're known as knockout artists, and in fact, it's part of their aura when they go into the ring. So it almost gives them a psychological edge against opponents, which is great in one way. But do you think it gives them a disadvantage or later on? Because if they then get knocked out, then you get a situation where fighters who might have been wary of them think, actually, hang on, they might have a punch, but I can actually stop them here. Whereas before, when they were unbeaten and just knocking people out one after another, that aura was almost an aura of invincibility because it seems so frightening.
Yeah. Again, that's a really good point, because that was something that really fascinated me, was if you're a knockout artist and that's how you live by that sword, then what happens when you get knocked out? And it's a problem. It's a real problem. And Wilder has always really fascinated me. And what has happened to him in recent times has been particularly interesting, because if you're the guy who hands out knockouts to anyone who fancies one, and you've knocked out literally everybody that you've boxed, then what happens when that cloak of invincibility is ripped away from you and you get knocked out? And the answer is it's very, very difficult. So Wilder's a good example of what I was just talking about, because he was undefeated, then he ran into Fury. The first fight, okay, we think he was fortunate to get a draw, and I would always stick by that, but he knocked him down twice. So that aura was still kind of there. He didn't manage to put him away, which was very unusual for him, but he knocked him down twice. So in that sense, he was the superior specimen in there, the superior pure fighting specimen, because knockdowns in boxing are at a premium. And then in the second fight, he got smashed to bits. And I just wondered what would happen as a result of that. And he came out with all sorts of excuses, didn't he, to try and sell that defeat to himself. Because in the ring immediately afterwards, he basically just said, look, it is what it is. I'll be back. And the most honest reaction you'll get from a fighter is always the first one. And then after that, they go away and they think to themselves, no, that's not gonna work. And then it's the costume, and then he's tampered with the gloves, and then it's some other things, and then it's Mark Breland stopping the fight, and anything you can think of basically to try and keep that confidence intact, because that confidence has been shattered. And it's even worse when that is your stock in trade, that's what you do to other people. And I'd imagine that he probably got to the point, Wilder, where he wouldn't have thought that that could happen to him. And Mike Tyson, before he boxed Buster Douglas, what was he, 37-0? I'd have thought he probably didn't think that could happen to him. It's, yeah, if that's where you live your boxing life, if that's the kind of air that you're breathing, then if you find yourself on the other side of that coin, it can be very, very difficult to come back from that.
So does it show that you need a good team around you if you're a boxer, especially in that state? Because if you get stopped and then people are saying to you, okay, you can come back from this as long as you do this, that, and the other, then that's all well and good. But then if you've got the opposite side where basically people are kissing your backside, even if for a knockout, or to say it's a fluke and whatnot, it might take you longer to actually come back from that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I think confidence is so important. I mean, just in life generally, but particularly in sport, and particularly in that kind of, in boxing, you've got to have that resolute self-belief. If you don't have it, then you're finished. You know, if you lose that, then you may as well stop. So if you're around a fighter, I think that's what you've got to be looking for more than anything else. You've got to be looking at them and thinking, do they still really believe in themselves? Because if they do, and they're at that kind of level, then a successful comeback is absolutely possible. Even if other people think they're deluded and they've gone absolutely mad, if they really and truly believe it, then I think you can get on board with it. If you get the suspicion that maybe that confidence has gone, that they don't really believe it, that they're trying to convince themselves, and I think it would be quite easy to tell the difference between someone trying to convince themselves and someone who has real confidence. If you feel like they've lost that, then you've got to tell them, listen, the edge is gone. I think we're done now. And hope that they listen to you. Hope that they're relieved almost that somebody else has seen it and taken that decision away from them. But with the example of somebody like Wilder, after all those bizarre excuses after the second fight, no one really wanted to see the third fight. But he wanted it so much that he went through the courts to get it. And when I saw that he'd done that, I thought to myself, okay, like, he obviously really thinks he's going to, that was an anomaly. It was a blip. And that he can win this third fight, and that he's going to stand in that ring in that third fight, not quite as good as new, but still like he always has been, and swing until his last breath. And that's exactly what he did. And even though he lost, I was at that fight, and I left the arena that night just blown away by the fact that he was fine to just walk back into that fire, knowing what it had done to him the previous time, knowing what could happen. He was just completely accepting of it. Because that's quite unusual. But you absolutely do need good people around you to tell you some hard truths. But again, it comes down to their pure desire to be in there and to do it. Because if that is still there, then they'll still train hard. If that's gone, then they won't really want to train. Training all of a sudden will become difficult. Injuries all of a sudden will become more painful. Everything will become harder. And you'll see that, and you'll know that basically that desire and hunger and belief isn't quite there anymore. And at that really top level, if you lose just a bit of it, that's enough. And that's what's happened to Wilder recently, because he came back against Hellenius and knocked him out. And everyone decided, great, you know, he's still in business, he's still with us. But we couldn't possibly know off the back of that, because that third fight with Fury was absolutely hellacious. I mean, that's a good big chunk off both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we saw him before Christmas, and I was around him quite a lot that week, he was different. He didn't have that darkness around him that he used to have during fight week. He was talking about ayahuasca, and he was very zen, and he was great company and really interesting to talk to. And I got him for a couple of minutes for the book, and you know, I just thought to myself, wow, if I could have a proper sit down with him. He just seemed so tuned in to all of the things that I would have wanted to discuss. But I did think at the same time, this bodes really well for the rest of his life, but it doesn't bode well for boxing. You know, he needs to still be that nasty guy. He got beaten by Joseph Parker, and then he came back for the most recent one, insisting, no, the bronze bomb is still in there. But I didn't find that convincing. I just didn't find it convincing at all. He was trying to convince himself. And I hope he retires now, because it's gone. That razor sharp edge that you need to have, it's gone. And I do think that the people around him will be telling him, because it's quite obvious.
Yeah. Two of my favourite chapters in your book about duty of care. And we'll start off with the referees. What did referees tell you in regards to how they decided to stop a fight? Was it their own experiences? Was it experience of what the fighter's been through? Or what did they say in that regard?
Referees just kind of have to make their own mind up on everything, really. When you look in the rule book, what you always see is the referee is the sole arbiter, and there's no painting by numbers. They're not really given that much help. They do just rely completely on their own experience. And it's a really difficult line that they have to tread when it comes to stoppages, because they all said to me that the number one concern is always the welfare of the fighter. That is the overriding concern, the overriding factor, but it's not the only factor. The scale of the fight, the scale of the reward, all of those things, they make a difference in terms of like how much further you might be willing to let a fight go than you would, so long as it's still competitive, than you would if it was a 4-6 or an 8-rounder, you know, earlier in the night, lower down on the card. And the fact that it's the entertainment business, again, that is something that they do think about. Never to the point where it would see them leave a fighter in there if they feel they should stop it. If they make that calculation that they should stop it, then they will stop it. But they're aware that, you know, these are people's livelihoods, these are people's careers, and that the decisions they make can be really impactful, not just on their health, but also on all sorts of other things. So it's a really complicated mixture. And they will let a fight finish in a knockout if that is the natural conclusion, because sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. I spoke to Victor Lachlan about Macklin against Moore, and he said at no point really before the knockout was he that close to stopping it. He said there was probably a couple of times where he could have stopped it either way. Jamie was under a lot of pressure, Matt was under a lot of pressure, but he felt, no, this is still really competitive. Either one of them could still win. If it turned into a one-sided beatdown, and then your experienced eye tells you, right, well, this one guy now, he can't win, then you stop it. But that wasn't what he got. And in the end, it was just kind of inevitable that would finish by knockout. And it's not, I was going to say, it's not that you let it happen, but you kind of do, because that's the sport. And it leaves them in a very vulnerable position sometimes, because, you know, bad things can happen in there and they have to live with it if they do. And often, almost always, it's not their fault. There's nothing they could have done differently, but a punch lands in a certain place, somebody gets badly injured or dies, and that's something that they've got to carry around with them for the rest of their life. So there are so many things for them to think about, And it was an absolute pleasure to talk to them, because they take it, of course they take it seriously, but they take it so much more seriously, I think, than people realize, because it's really not something I would want to do, to have that responsibility. It's really not.
And same subject, but with trainers. Obviously, I know going back to Deontay Wilder, he wasn't happy when Mark Breland basically threw in the towel at the end, second Fury fight. How obviously a trainer needs to know their fighters to know how much punishment they can take. But I imagine you also have to think about if a boxer's going to carry on their career and the long term health as well. So, what process do trainers go through in regards to knowing when to think, okay, we'll throw in the towel?
I think it. I mean, it's similar to the referee, but I think it's probably worse, because you do know the fighter, and therefore the temptation to leave them in there a bit too long, because you so desperately want them to win for them. You know, there's never any place for a trainer who makes it about themselves and they want the win for their own glory, and the fighter is just an extension of what they want to achieve. You know, you get them, but they're no good. But all the trainers I spoke to, none of them were like that, even remotely. And then the problem is, how do you decide when enough is enough? And what Joe Gallagher said to me, and other guys said the same in so many words, is that if you get to a point in the fight where, to turn it around, he's going to need to do something that you've never really seen him do before in the gym or in the ring, then, and he's on the receiving end and he's not really showing you too much, then you stop it then, because there's no point in leaving him in there. You need to know that at that point he can no longer win. He or she can no longer win. And you have to react according to what is actually happening in front of your eyes, not as a result of what you would like to be happening. Of course, you would like them to recover and produce this Rocky style comeback, but is that actually possible given what you've seen from them in your relationship up until that point? And if the answer is no, then you stop it. But sometimes you have to leave them in there to kind of discover a layer to themselves, if you like, that they didn't previously know that they had. So it's an even fight. They're doing well, or they're doing well enough. Maybe they're down, but they're not down by that much. And you still definitely feel there's more in there for them to give. Maybe they're not that keen to give it, but it's your job to try and, you think it's there. You're confident enough that it's there. You've seen enough from them in the past that you feel like in this instance it is there. Then you have to try and force it out of them. And that's a difficult position to be in, because people are very quick to criticize trainers for being, brave with other people's bodies. But as you said, you want your fighter to win. You know that this might be the biggest fight of their career, and that if they do win this one, then the next one, that'll be the one where they really make the money that can set them up for life. So these are all the kinds of things that run through their mind, and they don't have very long to make decisions either. They don't have very long at all. And the amount of time they have in between rounds to try and get their message across to a fighter, or bring them round if they're in that fog and they've been hurt, it's a very, very pressurized job. And again, like the referees, it's not one I would want.
Do you have a favourite knockout yourself that you've seen? Or knockouts, if one's too hard?
I've seen so many over the last couple of years that I don't really know if I do. I do really like the knockout between Pacquiao and Marquez. And even describing it as liking it, I kind of twitch slightly as I say it, because should I really like that? Pacquiao just goes down face first and he's out cold for about 5 minutes. But I'm drawn to it, definitely. That was a absolutely cataclysmic knockout in a massive, massive fight. The one I've seen recently between Joshua and Ngannou, again, to say that I liked it is, well, I would have to say that I liked it because it was thrilling. And this taps back into what we talked about at the start, doesn't it? But the way that Joshua just stepped in and demolished him was just incredibly raw visceral Neanderthal stuff almost, but also highly skilled. So that was a different kind of knockout. The Dillian White one you mentioned against Alexander Povetkin, that was really impactful because of the scenario as well. And as I say, you could hear him land basically on the boards of the ring because there were very, very few people there because, as I said, it was a COVID show and it was basically in the middle of the Hearns back garden, so essentially a big field late at night in summer. Yeah, they all kind of have a mystique and an allure of their own, really. How about you? Have you got any that stand out?
A few. I mean, Hatton Pacquiao.
Oh God, yeah, that's a wild scene, that isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Especially because if you remember, the clapperboard actually sounded just before he threw the punch. So even though Pacquiao's dominating, my first thought was, oh, we'll get to the end of this round, and then suddenly it ended like that. Um, there's one I've seen many times. It's actually from the early 80s. Is Wilfred Benitez when he knocked out Maurice Hope. And it's
Oh
only a
yeah,
short punch, but it's, I mean, you talk about frightening when you see Maurice Hope on the canvas and he's twitching, you think, okay, that's as spectacular as it is. You look at it and you do think, okay,
hmm
realize how well that punch was delivered by Benitez. Um, and then there's another one I've seen before, which is Tommy Hearns with his first world title fight against Cuevas.
yeah,
Again, because that had a sense of irritability. And he was in his hometown anyway, and also Hearns, obviously for welterweight, was very tall, very long reach, and this was against a guy who had a long, high knockout ratio in Cuevas, and he just thought Hearns just demolished him, and especially the
yeah.
one punch that he span him around, he like span around on the spot and then hit him again and fell. So I'll say those three are my favourite knockouts, but it's a weird experience because obviously I've reported, not so much now, but I've reported from when I first started writing from fights. And the thing that struck me is what you see on TV is completely different to when you're really up close and personal.
It is,
That
isn't it? It's really different. I spoke to Hauser about this, Thomas Hauser, and he came up with a really good line, which is that TV cosmetizes the violence, and it does, doesn't it? Because when you're ringside, it's just it can be a bit like watching a computer game, watching boxing on TV, because you don't hear the weight of the punches, you don't really see the boxer's reaction. But yeah, it's a completely different thing, isn't it? When you're up close or close enough rather than watching it at home.
Yeah, yeah. I remember, I think it was a few years ago, I went to Casemiro when he won his WBR title, super bantamweight, because the fight happened to be in my hometown. It was on a Frank Warren show. And again, just seeing that, and I was really up close, how his opponent was just struggling through that and spinning. And you just think, again, I still can't keep coming back to the sport because I still think it's spectacular. But again, there's ambivalence in your head thinking, okay, what is the damage that's actually being done? And I think you touch on that in the book in terms of what knockout does on an individual level. Obviously, it's a cumulative effect, but certainly at individual level, what each knockout does to a fighter.
Yeah, and it's it is difficult to quantify because some of them do seem to be able to shrug it off. Amir, for example, you know, he came back from that knockout against Prescott. Although that the interesting thing about that is that most people's recollection of that knockout was that he was iced out cold, and he wasn't. He got up both times. He got up the second time on about 10 or 11, probably. There's no way the ref would ever let him continue. But that's another thing. Like that, technically speaking, that is a knockout. Um, but because he managed to get up, that means it makes it easier to get over. And if somebody manages to do that, even if they've been actually knocked out for say 4 or 5 seconds, then they come round and they manage somehow to struggle to their feet. That's a big one. That they can really cling to that. George Groves against Carl Froch. He was out for 2 or 3 seconds, and that's why Charlie Fitch swooped in, looked in his eyes, the referee, and said, "No, that's it." But he did manage to get up, and that would have been big for him, I think, in terms of his recovery, because you can give yourself that. At least you can tell yourself that. But if you're just knocked out cold, and the next thing you remember is being back in the dressing room, or you're asking to people, you're having to ask people what happened, and you've got that kind of loss of time. Basically, your space-time continuum has been interrupted, and this piece of it has been stolen, which you'll never get back. That has got to be difficult to reconcile yourself with, because how do you just kind of think, all right, well, that happened, let's not worry too much about that. I suppose that's the only way you can do it, but not that many people can do that.
Andy Clarke, it's been a real pleasure talking to you about this particular subject. In regards to yourself, just quickly before we wrap up, are you planning to write any more books, or what is the future for you writing wise?
Yeah, I'd love to do it again. I would love to do it again. It's all about finding a subject, isn't it, really? Because this one, I got more and more interested in it as I went along, which is great, because you don't want to find yourself, I'd imagine, it's the first time I've done it, but I've spoken to people who've written numerous books, and they found themselves halfway through a couple of times and had to abandon it because they realized it wasn't quite as interesting as they initially thought. And if they'd lost interest in it, then they didn't feel there was any point just finishing it off, because if they weren't interested, then why should anybody else be? So it is about finding the right subject, but the discipline of it, and the kind of task, and all of those things, it definitely suited me. I really enjoyed it. I've got a couple of ideas for something that I could do next, which is a little bit different, to sort of stylistically, maybe to the one I've just done. But yeah, I mean, I would love to, but I'm certainly not assuming that I'll get the chance to, because it's a rough old game. It's a tough game, isn't it? Getting a book over the line with a publisher is hard. And I just feel I'm just really glad that I got the chance to do this one, because the stars kind of aligned for me. It took a while to get the deal, don't get me wrong, but the stars aligned in that it was a really good subject. I had a really long time to think about it. So by the time we did get a deal, I've been thinking about it for about a year and a half. So I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to. They were all willing to talk about it and really helpful in terms of making that happen. And I got to the end of it, and I just thought, you know what? I'm happy with this. Other people will decide how good they think it is, but I have no regrets. You know, I did my work. I did my best. And I think it's something I'll always be proud of it. And I think that's all you can really hope for, I guess, when you start. You certainly don't want to finish, do you? And think, God, if only I got hold of this guy or that guy, it would have been better. And if I'd had more time, and you know, you don't want that. And I didn't have that. So yeah, I'm happy.
Well, I'll leave a link to on the description in regards to where you can get the book. All right, Andy Clarke, again, thank you so much for coming on to the 286 project.
No problem. Cheers, Chris. Thanks a lot.